The crack of a rifle shot was the first sound that broke the hypnotic rhythm of the journey. It was followed an instant later by a splintering thud as the bullet tore through the wooden frame of the stagecoach inches from Abigail Porter's head. She flinched, the sharp report echoing the gunfire that still haunted her dreams. Outside, the driver's curse was swallowed by the panicked screams of the horses and the sudden chaotic thunder of hooves. A half-dozen masked riders swarmed the coach, materializing from the dusty Wyoming haze like phantoms born of heat and violence. "Pull up, damn you!" A raw voice bellowed over the pounding of hooves and the creak of strained leather. The coach driver, a grizzled man named Elias, fought the reins, his face a mask of grim determination beneath a sweat-stained hat. He cracked his whip, the sound a sharp counterpoint to the gunfire, urging the terrified team forward in a desperate bid for escape. Another shot rang out clean and final. Elias slumped forward with a choked cry, the reins falling from his lifeless hands. The stagecoach, now pilotless, careened wildly, its wheels catching in the deep ruts of the trail. The world tilted, a dizzying lurch of earth and sky, as the lead horse went down in a tangle of leather and limbs. Abigail was thrown against the opposite seat, the impact stealing her breath. The coach shuddered to a halt at a sickening angle dust, and the metallic scent of blood filling the small compartment. Before she could recover, the door was wrenched open. A man loomed in the opening, a dirty bandana covering the lower half of his face, his eyes cold and hard. "Out, all of you," he snarled, brandishing a Colt revolver that seemed an extension of his arm. The other passengers, a portly salesman whose face had gone a pasty white, and a timid-looking woman clutching her young son, scrambled out, hands raised high. Abigail followed, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the terror that threatened to paralyze her. Her training in the chaos of battlefield hospitals, a crucible of noise and fear, had forged an iron composure within her. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. The outlaws were brutally efficient. They herded the passengers away from the coach, while two of their number rifled through the luggage strapped to the roof. The leader, a tall man distinguished by a silver conchoed belt, strode toward Abigail, his spurs kicking up small clouds of alkali dust that coated every surface like a fine layer of bone. "Your valuables, ma'am," he said, his voice a low growl. "Jewelry money. Hand it over." Abigail complied without protest, untying the small reticule from her wrist. It contained little of value, a few dollars, a train ticket stub, and a silver locket from her late sister Emily. He grunted, unimpressed, and turned his attention to her other belongings. His eyes fell on the black leather medical bag at her feet. "What's in there?" he demanded. "Medical supplies?" Abigail answered, her voice steady. "They are of no use to you. Let me be the judge of that." He reached for it, but Abigail moved faster, placing her body between him and the bag. "I am a nurse," she said, her tone hardening. "There are instruments in that bag, medicines. They are for healing the sick, not for lining your pockets." The outlaw laughed, a harsh grating sound. "A do-gooder. We'll see what they fetch in Cheyenne." He shoved her aside, but she held her ground with a surprising rooted strength. Her fingers closed around the handle of the bag, her knuckles white. "You will not take it," she stated, not as a plea but as a fact. His amusement faded, replaced by irritation. He raised his hand to strike her, but another outlaw, a younger, leaner man, called out from the coach. "Found something, boss?" He emerged holding a small, polished wooden box. It was a simple thing, unadorned, except for the smooth, rich grain of the cherry wood. The leader's attention shifted. "What is it?" "Just a music box, looks like." As the younger man moved to toss it to his leader, Abigail's carefully constructed composure shattered. A raw, guttural cry escaped her lips. She lunged, not at the leader, but at the man holding the box, moving with a feral intensity that stunned them all. She clawed at his arm, her nails digging into his flesh through his worn shirt. "No, give that back." The outlaw, startled by her ferocity, stumbled back, dropping the box. It landed in the thick dust with a soft thud. Abigail dove for it, shielding it with her body as if it were a living thing. "Get off it, you crazy woman." the leader snarled, striding toward her. He aimed a vicious kick at her side, but she curled tighter, her arms wrapped protectively around the wooden box. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her ribs, but she only gasped, refusing to cry out or release her grip. The sound of a distant whistle, sharp and clear, cut through the tense standoff. The outlaws froze, their heads swiveling toward the east. "That's the patrol signal," one of them hissed. "We gotta go." The leader cursed, his eyes lingering on Abigail in the box for a moment longer, a look of grudging respect mixing with his anger. "Leave it. It ain't worth a hanging." He turned and swung himself onto his horse. "Let's ride." Within seconds, they were gone, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze, leaving behind a scene of dust, death, and stunned silence. The salesman helped the crying woman and her son, while Abigail slowly pushed herself to her knees, clutching the music box to her chest. Her side throbbed, and her hands were scraped and bleeding. The dust settled, revealing the still form of the driver slumped over the front of the coach. As she looked at the carnage, the dust and the heat of the Wyoming afternoon dissolved, replaced by the humid, cloying air of a Virginia field hospital near Appomattox. The memory came unbidden, sharp and visceral. She was kneeling again, not in dust, but in mud and blood, beside a makeshift cot. A boy no older than 19 lay dying. His uniform was Union blue, his face pale and slick with the sweat of a fever that no medicine could break. His name was James Thorne. "Miss Porter." He had whispered, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the groans of the other wounded. "I'm here, James," she had replied, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, the simple act a small anchor of comfort in a sea of suffering. His trembling hand had reached for the small wooden box on the crate beside his bed. "For my brother." "Nathaniel," he had gasped, his breathing ragged. Tell him I was proud. Tell him the sacrifice was worth it." He pressed the box into her hands. It was warm from his fever. The melody. He'll remember. He had tried to say more, something about a secret, a letter hidden inside, but a racking cough had seized him, and by the time it passed, his eyes were glassy, his last breath a faint sigh that was lost in the cacophony of the ward. The relentless Wyoming sun brought her back to the present. Abigail's fingers tightened around the smooth wood of the music box. A promise made to a dying boy. A secret she had carried for 3 long years. Now this brutal, violent encounter had cemented its importance. Whatever else was taken from her, she would not lose this. She would find Nathaniel Thorne and deliver his brother's final message. Pushing the pain in her side away, she retrieved her medical bag, her purpose clearer and more urgent than ever before. The West had shown its teeth, but Abigail Porter was not a woman to be easily broken. Red Pine, Wyoming materialized from the vast, snow-covered landscape like a mirage, a scattering of wooden buildings huddled together against the wilderness. It was less a town and more an outpost connected by snow-packed paths rather than proper streets. The air was sharp and thin, so cold it burned the lungs. Abigail, wrapped in a thick buffalo hide in Thomas Wheeler's sleigh, felt the weariness settle deep into her bones. The blacksmith had found her half-frozen near the wreckage of the stagecoach, a lone survivor in an ocean of white. "Here we are," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. "Not Boston, I reckon, but it's home." He helped her down, his grip strong and steady. The town's few residents paused their activities to watch her arrival. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store, her face weathered, as old leather studied the sleigh with undisguised curiosity. 2 men outside the saloon tipped their hats, their expressions a mixture of concern and intrigue. Abigail was a disruption, a story to be told and retold through the long winter nights. The Wheeler home, situated above the blacksmith's forge, was small, but radiated a palpable warmth. The air was heavy with the scent of coal-hot metal and baking bread. Martha Wheeler, Thomas's wife, was a woman whose kindness was etched into the lines around her eyes. She clucked over Abigail like a mother hen, pressing a mug of steaming broth into her hands and insisting she sit by the fire. Thomas said, "You survived a night out in that blizzard." Martha said, her voice a mixture of awe and pity. "You must have an angel watching over you, child." "Or a stubborn streak," Abigail replied, the warm broth beginning to thaw the chill that had settled in her marrow. "That too," Martha chuckled. "A woman needs one to survive out here." Abigail spent 2 days recovering under the Wheelers' care, her body slowly mending from the cold and the ordeal of the robbery. The cut on her temple was healing, and the deep ache in her ribs was beginning to subside. During that time, she explained the purpose of her journey, carefully omitting the more dramatic details of her promise to James Thorne. She simply presented the letter that had summoned her west, its paper now wrinkled and water-stained. "I've come to marry Nathaniel Thorne," she explained, watching Martha's face for a reaction. The older woman's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "I see," she said after a moment. "Nathaniel's a fine carpenter. Keeps to himself mostly, especially since Hannah passed." "The letter mentioned his daughter Catherine has been motherless for 3 years," Abigail offered. Martha nodded slowly, her hands busy with her mending. "Catherine's a special child. Bright as a new penny, looks just like her mother around the eyes." She fell silent, and Abigail sensed there was more she wasn't saying. On the 3rd morning, the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. The sun so bright on the new snow, it hurt the eyes. Thomas announced the trail to the Thorne homestead was passable. As he hitched his sturdy horse to the sleigh, Martha pressed a basket into Abigail's hands. "Some bread and preserves," she said, a small welcome gift. As they pulled away from the blacksmith shop, Abigail felt the town's gaze upon her. Word travels fast in a small town, she observed. Thomas chuckled, the sound muffled by his frost-rimmed beard. "Faster than a telegraph. They all know you're the mail-order bride come for Nathaniel Thorne. I'd wager there will be some surprise when you arrive, though." Something in his tone made Abigail look at him sharply. "Why do you say that?" The blacksmith's expression became carefully neutral. "Just that Nathaniel's a private man. Doesn't seem the type to advertise for a wife, is all." Before Abigail could question him further, the sleigh rounded a bend, and the town disappeared. The landscape opened into a vast panorama of white plains and distant dark smudges of pine forest. Mountains rose in the distance, their jagged peaks scraping the sky. The sheer, untamed scale of it was breathtaking. It was a harsh beauty, one that demanded respect and resilience. The relentless sun had bleached the very color from the sky near the horizon, and the alkali dust, where the wind had scoured the snow away, coated every surface like a fine layer of bone. "There it is," Thomas said eventually, pointing ahead. "Thorne's place." A modest log house appeared nestled at the edge of a pine forest. Smoke rose in a thin, steady column from its stone chimney. Everything about the homestead, from the neatly stacked firewood to the carved shutters flanking each window, spoke of skilled hands and meticulous attention to detail. As the sleigh crunched to a halt, the front door opened. A tall, lean man stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. His face was framed by a neatly trimmed beard, but Abigail could see deep-set blue eyes studying her with an expression of profound confusion. A pale scar traced a thin line from his left temple into his hairline. "Nathaniel," Thomas called out. "Brought you some company. This is Miss Abigail Porter, all the way from Boston." Nathaniel Thorne stepped down from the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. His gaze never left Abigail's face. "Miss Porter," he said, his voice deep and cautious. "I've come in response to your letter," she said, her own voice sounding thin in the vast silence. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "My letter." Before he could say more, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "Is she here? Is she the one?" An 8-year-old girl with dark braids and her father's intense blue eyes appeared on the porch. Her face, flushed with excitement, broke into a wide grin at the sight of Abigail. "You came? You really came?" She flew down the steps, but Nathaniel caught her by the shoulders. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying a stern warning. "What do you know about this?" The girl looked up at her father, a mixture of defiance and guilt crossing her face. "I did it, Papa," she confessed, her voice surprisingly steady. "I wrote to the Western Bride Society." A heavy silence descended. Abigail felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. She reached into her coat and withdrew the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. "You didn't write this?" she asked Nathaniel, the words feeling foolish as she said them. He took the letter, his disbelief growing as he scanned the contents. "No, ma'am. I did not." His gaze shifted to his daughter, who was now studying her boots with intense interest. "Catherine Grace Thorne, what have you done?" The girl raised her chin, a picture of childish determination. "Papa required a domestic partner, and I required a maternal influence." She recited the formal words, sounding both absurd and heartbreaking, coming from a child. "Miss Eliza's magazine said it was a respectable arrangement. I took one of your papers and copied your writing." Thomas Wheeler cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Perhaps I should head back to town now." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing a deep weariness that seemed at odds with his physical strength. He was a man who conserved words as carefully as he conserved resources. And now he was faced with a situation that demanded more than he had. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "No, stay a moment, Thomas." He turned back to Abigail, his face a complex mask of embarrassment and frustration. "Miss Porter, I don't know what to say. I am profoundly sorry for this deception." Abigail swallowed hard, the ground shifting beneath her. The long journey, the robbery, the near-death experience in the blizzard, all of it precipitated by a lonely child's desperate act. "I understand, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt. "Clearly there has been a grave misunderstanding." The blizzard that had nearly claimed Abigail's life returned with a vengeance that afternoon, trapping her at the homestead. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and snow swirled in dense curtains, erasing the world beyond the cabin walls. For a week, the three of them were confined to the small, warm space, a reluctant makeshift family forged by a child's deception and a storm's fury. The first 2 days were thick with an awkward silence. Nathaniel was a ghost in his own home, his movements precise and controlled as he worked on a small carving, and the tension in his jaw a constant testament to his discomfort. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. Abigail, determined not to be a burden, made herself useful, helping Catherine with her lessons and mending torn clothing from a basket in the corner. The thaw began on the third night. Abigail was woken by a small, distressed cry from Catherine's room. She found the child tossing in her bed, her skin hot and dry to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid. Papa, Catherine whimpered, her eyes glassy with fever. "My throat hurts." Nathaniel was there in an instant, his face etched with a familiar fear that Abigail recognized immediately, the helplessness of a parent watching his child suffer. He felt Catherine's forehead, his large calloused hand gentle against her skin. "She's burning up," he said, his voice tight with worry. He moved to the medicine cabinet, retrieving a bottle of patent medicine from the general store. Abigail stopped him with a quiet but firm hand on his arm. "That will only mask the symptoms, and the alcohol in it is not good for a child's fever," she said. "Let me." Nathaniel looked at her, his skepticism warring with his desperation. "What can you do?" "I am a nurse, Mr. Thorne," she reminded him gently. "This is what I do." She retrieved her medical bag, the familiar weight of it a comfort. Working with practiced efficiency, she prepared a cool compress for Catherine's head and brewed a tea from willow bark and yarrow herbs she carried for reducing fever and fighting infection. Nathaniel watched her every move, his initial reluctance slowly giving way to a grudging respect as he observed her calm competence. For 2 days, Abigail nursed the sick child. She sat by Catherine's bedside, patiently spooning broth and herbal teas between her lips, changing compresses and murmuring soothing words. She told Catherine stories of the stars, how sailors used them as maps to find their way home across vast dark oceans. Nathaniel, unable to work in his shop, remained in the main room, the rhythmic scrape of his whittling knife, the only sound besides the storm, and Catherine's fevered breathing. He saw the compassion in Abigail's touch, the deep well of knowledge in her eyes. He saw her tending to his daughter with a devotion that went far beyond professional duty. On the 5th day, the fever broke. Catherine woke weak but clear-eyed and asked for a glass of water. The relief in the cabin was a palpable thing. Nathaniel looked at Abigail across the small room, his eyes conveying a gratitude too profound for his terse vocabulary. "Thank you." He said the two words weighted with a significance that a longer speech could never have achieved. That evening, as Catherine slept peacefully, they sat by the fire. The storm had begun to abate, its fury spent. "You saved her," Nathaniel said, breaking a long silence. He was no longer whittling, he was simply watching the flames. "Her own strength did most of the work. I only helped guide it," Abigail replied. "Hannah, my wife? She died of a lung sickness," he said, the confession costing him visible effort. "The doctor from Cheyenne came, but there was nothing he could do. I watched her waste away. I felt useless." Abigail's heart ached for him. "Sometimes all we can do is bear witness and offer comfort. There is no shame in that." He turned to look at her, then truly seeing her not as an intrusion, but as the woman who had brought healing into his home. "You're not like anyone I've ever met, Miss Porter. Please call me Abigail." The quiet intimacy of the moment was broken by a cry from the attic room where Nathaniel slept. It was a single, anguished name, torn from the depths of a nightmare. "Reed, don't." Nathaniel stiffened, his face paling. He rose quickly. "I should check the fire." He moved away, but not before Abigail saw the flicker of sheer panic in his eyes. The name was not his, nor was it his brother's, as far as she knew. It was another piece of a puzzle she was beginning to realize was far more complex than she had ever imagined. She thought of the scar at his temple, the way his hands, so skilled with wood, sometimes moved with the disciplined precision of a soldier. She recalled a conversation during the blizzard where he had, without thinking, described the strategic importance of a ridge visible from the window in purely military terms. The clues were disparate, confusing, but they pointed to a man with a past he kept locked away, as securely as he had locked away his heart. The days after Catherine's recovery were different. The tension had been replaced by a quiet companionship. Nathaniel began to speak more, sharing stories of building the homestead, of Hannah's love for the wildflowers that bloomed in the spring. He taught Abigail how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits in the snow. In return, she told him of Boston, of her work at the hospital, of her sister Emily. They were two solitary people, slowly, cautiously learning the geography of each other's grief. When the blizzard finally ended, the world outside was a pristine, silent wilderness of white. Thomas Wheeler arrived the next day, his sleigh cutting the first new tracks toward the homestead. His relief at finding them all safe and well was evident. "I was beginning to worry," he admitted. "Another day, and I'd have brought a search party." The path back to Red Pine was clear. The obstacle that had held Abigail captive was gone. Yet as she looked at Nathaniel and at Catherine, who now clung to her hand, the thought of leaving felt less like an escape and more like an exile. The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered a week later by the arrival of a letter. A neighbor delivered it, having picked it up with his own mail in Red Pine. It was addressed to Nathaniel, the envelope of fine, expensive paper, the script elegant and unfamiliar. Abigail watched as Nathaniel took it, his face immediately shuddering, the open, relaxed man of the past few days, disappearing behind a mask of guarded tension. He read it standing by the window, his back to her. When he finished, he folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. But Abigail saw that his hand was trembling slightly. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "It's nothing," he said, his voice too tight, too controlled. "Business from back east." He immediately changed the subject, asking Catherine about her lessons, with a forced cheerfulness that did not deceive Abigail. Later that afternoon, she overheard him arguing with Thomas Wheeler, who had come to deliver a custom-made hinge for the barn door. Their voices were low, but she caught snippets through the open workshop door. "Can't just ignore him," Nathaniel Thomas was saying. "He has no right." Nathaniel retorted, his voice strained. "Not after all this time. Right or not, Victor Hayward is a man who gets what he wants. You know that better than anyone. It's about the land claim, isn't it?" He always felt Hannah's share should have reverted to him. "It's about more than the land," Nathaniel said, and the profound weariness in his tone made Abigail's heart ache. Victor Hayward. The name lodged in her mind. Driven by a protective instinct that had grown stronger each day, Abigail invented a reason to ride into Red Pine with Thomas. She needed more herbs, she claimed, though her medical bag was well stocked. In the warmth of the Wheelers' kitchen, while Thomas was busy at the forge, she spoke to Martha. I couldn't help but overhear Nathaniel and Thomas speaking of a man named Victor Hayward. Martha sighed, setting down the sock she was darning. "Hannah's brother. A snake in a fancy suit, if you ask me. He never approved of Hannah marrying Nathaniel and moving out to what he called this God-forsaken wilderness. Blamed Nathaniel when she got sick, said he'd cut her off from her family and proper city doctors. He sounds difficult," Abigail said, choosing her word carefully. "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it." Martha scoffed. "Vindictive is more like it." After Hannah passed, he tried to claim guardianship of Catherine. Said Nathaniel wasn't a fit father. It took half the town signing affidavits about Nathaniel's character to make him back down. I thought we were rid of him. The pieces began to click into place. The letter, Nathaniel's sudden withdrawal, the argument with Thomas. Victor Hayward was not just a memory. He was an active threat. Abigail returned to the homestead that evening with a sense of foreboding, a feeling that the fragile peace they had found was about to be broken. Her premonition proved correct 2 days later. They saw the cutter approaching from a distance, a sleek, black shape moving swiftly across the snow, pulled by a fine-looking horse. It was an Easterner's rig, out of place in the rugged landscape. As it drew closer, Abigail saw it carried 2 men. Nathaniel, who had been repairing a fence near the barn, straightened up his body, going rigid. "Go inside, Abigail," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Take Catherine and stay there." But it was too late. Catherine, playing in the yard, had already spotted the visitors and was running toward the porch. Abigail followed, her heart pounding. The cutter pulled into the yard, and the driver, a well-dressed man with a severe face that matched Hannah's photographs, climbed down. The second man, who wore a tin star pinned to his heavy coat, remained seated. "Nathaniel," the man said, his voice smooth and cold. "It has been a long time." Victor Nathaniel acknowledged his tone devoid of warmth. "What do you want?" "I've come for my niece," Victor Hayward announced, his gaze sweeping past Nathaniel to where Catherine stood half-hidden behind Abigail. "I have grown weary of her being raised in this squalor by a man of questionable character." "You have no claim on her," Nathaniel said, taking a step forward. "Oh, but I do." Victor smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. He produced a set of documents from his coat. Guardianship papers signed and sealed by a judge in Boston. He was quite moved by my concerns for my late sister's child. He then nodded to the man in the cutter. "Sheriff, I believe you have business with this man as well." The sheriff climbed down, his face grim. He unfolded a piece of paper. "I have a warrant here for the arrest of one Nathaniel Reed on the charge of desertion from the Union Army, issued by the territorial magistrate." The name Reed was the one Nathaniel had cried out in his sleep. Abigail stared at him, at the blood draining from his face, at the sudden hunted look in his eyes. The world seemed to shrink to this single terrible moment. The conflict was no longer about a child's custody or land claim. It was about Nathaniel's life, his freedom, and a secret that was about to destroy them all. The sheriff, a reasonable but duty-bound man named Miller, seemed to take no pleasure in his task. He looked from Nathaniel's stricken face to the frightened child clinging to Abigail's skirts. "Thorn, or Reed," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "I have to take you in. Give me some time." Nathaniel pleaded, his voice strained. "I need to get my affairs in order. For my daughter." Victor Hayward smirked. Affairs? What affairs could a deserter possibly have? Sheriff Miller shot Victor a silencing glare. "I'm not a monster, Thorn. The trail back to Cheyenne is rough, and there's another storm front moving in. I'll hold you here under house arrest. I'll be back in 48 hours to transport you. That should give you enough time to arrange for the girl." He looked pointedly at Abigail. "It seems she has someone to look after her." With that, the sheriff mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a tense, suffocating silence in his wake. Victor, seeing his immediate goal thwarted, announced he would take a room in Red Pine and return with the sheriff in 2 days to collect Catherine. As his cutter disappeared down the trail, the reality of their situation crashed down on Abigail. 48 hours. A ticking clock stood between Nathaniel and a future that likely involved a prison cell or worse. "It's not true, is it?" Catherine cried, her small face streaked with tears as she looked up at her father. "You're not a bad man." Nathaniel knelt and pulled his daughter into a fierce hug. "No, Katie, I'm not." He looked over her head at Abigail, his eyes filled with despair. "But the charge, it's true in a way." "I don't understand," Abigail said, her mind racing, trying to connect the pieces, the nightmare, the military knowledge, the name Reed, and the dying soldier named James Thorn. That night, after a distraught, Catherine had cried herself to sleep. Nathaniel finally told her the story. They sat in the dim light of the fire, the house silent around them. "My family name is Reed," he began, his voice low and weary. "Nathaniel Reed. James was my younger brother. When the war started, he was desperate to enlist, but he had a weak heart. The doctors wouldn't pass him. When the draft came in '63, his name was called. It would have been a death sentence. His hands clenched into fists. Our mother had already lost our father. I couldn't let her lose James, too. So, we switched places. I had already served a short term before the war, so I knew the life. I became James Thorn, and he became Nathaniel Reed, staying behind to run the farm. But the Army records," Abigail whispered the truth, beginning to dawn with breathtaking clarity. "They would show Nathaniel Reed as a draftee who never reported for duty. A deserter," Nathaniel finished grimly. "I served out the war under James's name. I was wounded at Antietam." He touched the scar at his temple. "When the war ended, I couldn't go back. To the world, I was James Thorn, a decorated soldier. Nathaniel Reed was a criminal. To reveal the truth would have been to dishonor the arrangement, to disgrace my family, and to face a court-martial. So I came west to start over. I kept the name to honor my brother." And James, Abigail asked, her heart pounding. "What happened to him?" "He died of his heart condition a few months after the war ended." Nathaniel said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "Our mother passed soon after. There was nothing left for me back east. I told Hannah everything before we were married. She understood. She kept my secret." Abigail's mind flew back to the field hospital, to the dying soldier who had entrusted her with his music box and a message for his brother Nathaniel. Not Nathaniel Reed, Nathaniel Thorn. He had used the name his brother was living under, the only name he could be found by. And in his fevered state, he hadn't explained the switch, only the sacrifice. It all made a terrible, tragic sense. "We have to prove it," she said, her resolve hardening. "The letter, the one from your brother. It explains everything." She raced to her room and retrieved the music box. With trembling fingers, she found the hidden compartment she had only recently discovered and extracted the yellowed letter. Nathaniel took it, his hands shaking as he read the words his brother had written so long ago. Tears welled in his eyes as he read James's final testament. He knew, Nathaniel whispered. He knew I would find a good life. He looked up at Abigail, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Will this be enough? It's a start, she said. But it's the word of a dead man against official military records. We need more. We need corroboration. She looked at the clock on the mantel. Less than 40 hours remained. Thomas Wheeler. We need his help. The next morning before dawn, Abigail rode to Red Pine. She explained the situation to a shocked but resolute Thomas and Martha. I always knew there was more to Nathaniel than he let on, Thomas said, stroking his beard. A deserter? Never. Not that man. What can we do? Martha asked, her practical nature taking over. I need to get to Cheyenne, Abigail said. To the Territorial Records Office. There must be something. Homestead records, enlistment papers from Nathaniel's first service. Anything that can help prove he is who he says he is. And we need to find military records for James Thorne, the real one showing his honorable service. Thomas didn't hesitate. I'll take you. It's a hard ride, but we can make it by midday if we push the horses. While Thomas prepared a fresh team, Abigail wrote a hasty note to Nathaniel, telling him her plan and urging him to hold on to hope. She entrusted it to Martha to deliver. The journey to Cheyenne was a frantic race against time. The sleigh flew over the packed snow, the cold wind biting at their faces. They spoke little, the urgency of their mission hanging heavy between them. Cheyenne was a bustling, chaotic city, a stark contrast to the quiet wilderness. Thomas knew his way around, navigating the muddy streets to the Territorial Government building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale cigar smoke. A harried clerk looked at them over a pair of spectacles. Military records, he said doubtfully. Most of those are back in Washington. We only have territorial militia rolls. Please, Abigail insisted, anything you have from 1861 to 65. We are looking for enlistment papers for a Nathaniel Reed and service records for a James Thorne. For hours, they pored over dusty ledgers and brittle documents. They found James Thorne's record easily enough, a decorated soldier wounded at Antietam, honorably discharged. But Nathaniel Reed was a ghost. There was no record of his enlistment, only a note of his draft summons and his subsequent failure to appear. Despair began to set in. As the afternoon waned, Abigail knew their time was running out. They had to start back soon to reach the homestead before the sheriff. Wait, Thomas said, his finger tracing a line in a different ledger. Homestead claims. Look at this. He pointed to an entry from before the war, a claim filed jointly by Nathaniel Reed and James Reed for a parcel of land back east. The signature for Nathaniel Reed was a perfect match for the handwriting in Nathaniel's home. And look here, Thomas said, his voice rising with excitement. He pointed to the witness signature on a neighbor's claim. James Thorne. It's his signature. From before the war, when he was just a neighbor before they ever switched names. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was something. It was a documented link between the two names existing before the deception, signed in their own hands. It showed they were two distinct individuals who knew each other. Abigail carefully made a copy of the page. It's not enough, she said, her hope faltering. Maybe not for a court-martial, Thomas said grimly. But it might be enough for a reasonable sheriff. Let's go. We're burning daylight. The ride back was even more fraught than the journey in. The wind had picked up, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The impending storm seemed a mirror of the turmoil awaiting them at the homestead. They pushed the horses to their limit, arriving back in Red Pine just as dusk began to settle. They didn't stop urging the tired animals on for the final 2 miles. As they crested the last rise, they saw it. Sheriff Miller's horse was already tied to the porch rail. A second cutter, Victor Hayward's, was there as well. The 48 hours were up. They were out of time. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, a silence more deafening than a scream. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters as the storm descended in full force, mirroring the emotional tempest within. Sheriff Miller stood by the door, his expression grim and resolute. Victor Hayward sat at the table, a look of cold triumph on his face. Nathaniel stood before the hearth, his back to the fire, his posture rigid. Catherine was huddled in a rocking chair, her small face pale with fear. Abigail and Thomas burst in, bringing a swirl of snow and cold air with them. All heads turned in their direction. "The time is up, Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with regret. "Wait," Abigail pleaded, breathless from the cold and the frantic ride. She stepped forward, placing the copies from the records office and James's letter on the table. "Sheriff, you need to see these. This is not a simple case of desertion. It is a story of sacrifice." Victor scoffed. "A desperate last-minute fabrication. It changes nothing." "Let the woman speak," Sheriff Miller commanded, his eyes on Abigail. With as much composure as she could muster, Abigail told the story. She spoke of the two brothers of the pact, made to save one and honor the other. She presented James's letter, her voice trembling slightly as she read his final words of pride and love. She showed the sheriff the copies of the homestead records, pointing out the two distinct signatures, Nathaniel Reed and James Thorne, on documents that predated the war. "He is not Nathaniel Reed, deserter," she concluded, her gaze locking with Nathaniel's. "He is James Thorne, war hero, who took his brother's name after the war to protect his family and honor a promise. The man you should be looking for is Nathaniel Reed, who died peacefully years ago." The sheriff studied the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked from the letter to Nathaniel, then back again. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the roar of the wind. Nathaniel, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "Everything she says is true. I couldn't let my brother go to his death. I would make the same choice again." It seemed as though the sheriff was wavering the evidence of heroism and brotherly love, weighing against the cold facts of the military record. For a moment, it felt as if all might not be lost. This was the moment Abigail had to make her choice. Revealing the full truth of the identity swap, the fraudulent enlistment, the years of impersonation, was a double-edged sword. It could clear Nathaniel of desertion, but it would also be a public admission to a series of federal crimes. The consequences were unknown, potentially severe. This was no longer an easy decision to save an innocent man. It was a calculated risk, with his entire future hanging in the balance. Her heart pounded against her ribs. "Sheriff," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "There is more. The man I nursed in that hospital, the one who gave me this letter and the music box, his name was James Thorne. But he confessed to me before he died. He told me his real name was Nathaniel Reed. He was living a lie to protect the brother who had taken his place on the battlefield." She looked directly at Nathaniel, a silent apology in her eyes for revealing the final dangerous layer of the secret. "The man standing before you is not a deserter. He is a man who answered the call to duty when his brother could not. He is a hero." The room was utterly still. The weight of her confession of the long-held secret now laid bare seemed to suck the very air from the cabin. Victor Hayward, who had been watching with a cynical sneer, suddenly broke. The facade of righteous concern for his niece crumbled, revealing the raw grief beneath. "A hero," he choked out, his voice cracking. "He let my sister die out here alone. He filled her head with stories of this wild, beautiful place, and he brought her here to waste away while he hid from his past." He stood, his fists clenched, his face contorted by a sorrow so deep it was almost ugly. "I begged her not to come. I told her he was a man with no history, a man running from something. If she had stayed in Boston with proper doctors, with her family, she would still be alive." He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping, the fight gone out of him. I didn't want Catherine. I wanted someone to blame. His confession hung in the air, more shocking than the revelation of Nathaniel's identity. Victor was not a villain. He was a broken man, lashing out from a place of unbearable loss. His vendetta was not about land or custody. It was about grief. The climax had shifted. It was no longer a legal confrontation, but an emotional one. Sheriff Miller looked from the grieving Victor to the stoic Nathaniel, his lawman's certainty clearly shaken. He picked up James's letter again, reading it one last time. "This is the most extraordinary story I have ever heard," he said finally. He looked at Nathaniel. "You served honorably." "For 4 years," Nathaniel confirmed. The sheriff nodded slowly. "The charge is desertion. But it seems the man who was supposed to answer that charge has been dead for more than a decade. And the man who stands here in his place is by all accounts a decorated veteran and a respected member of this community." He folded the warrant and tucked it back into his coat. "I will file my report. I will include this letter and sworn affidavits from all of you. I will report that Nathaniel Reed is deceased and that this is a case of mistaken identity. I will recommend the matter be closed." Relief washed through Abigail so powerfully her knees felt weak. The sheriff tipped his hat. "My apologies for the intrusion, folks. Hayward, the storm's getting worse. You'd best stay the night in town." He turned and left, closing the door behind him against the raging blizzard. Victor did not move for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel, his eyes filled with a new painful understanding. "She loved you." He said the words barely a whisper. "Hannah, she truly loved you. She chose this life. She chose you." "Yes," Nathaniel said softly, "she did." Victor rose, a man diminished, but somehow ennobled by his confession. "I relinquish my claim on Catherine. She belongs here." Without another word, he walked out into the storm, a tragic figure seeking his own path through the wilderness of his grief. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world transformed, blanketed in a pristine layer of snow that muffled all sound. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet settled, one of peace and exhaustion. The community of Red Pine, informed of the events by Sheriff Miller and a humbled Thomas Wheeler, rallied around the Thorne family. What had been a story of a mysterious outsider became a legend of brotherly love and sacrifice. Nathaniel Reed, the quiet carpenter, was now Nathaniel Reed, the town's unlikely hero. In the calm, after the crisis, with the threat of the past finally vanquished, Nathaniel and Abigail found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered peaks. "I never thought I would feel free again," Nathaniel said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "For years I've been looking over my shoulder. Now." He trailed off, unable to articulate the immensity of the change. "Now you can just be Abigail," finished for him. She looked at him, at the man whose secrets she had unknowingly carried across the country, whose family she had stumbled into by a twist of fate. "Nathaniel," she began, her own heart full, "what we have been through." He turned to her, his blue eyes clear and direct. "What we have been through has shown me what truly matters. You, Abigail. You and Catherine. You walked into my life and brought it back from the brink. You fought for me when I had given up on fighting for myself." He took her hands in his. "I know this is not the life you planned, but I find I cannot imagine my life without you in it. I love you, Abigail Porter." Tears she hadn't shed during the entire ordeal now spilled down her cheeks. "I love you too, Nathaniel Reed." Their wedding was a simple affair held 2 weeks later in the small Red Pine church. The whole town attended. Martha Wheeler stood as Abigail's matron of honor, and Thomas Wheeler as Nathaniel's best man. Catherine, serving as flower girl, carried a small basket of pine boughs and winter berries, her face beaming with a joy so pure it brought a lump to everyone's throat. Life settled into a new, happy rhythm. Spring arrived, melting the snow, and bringing forth a riot of wildflowers. Abigail's medical skills were a blessing to the small community, and she found a deep sense of purpose in her work. Nathaniel's carpentry business thrived his hands, now creating with a lightness that hadn't been there before. Their love deepened with each passing day, a quiet, steady flame in the heart of their home. One afternoon in late May, a letter arrived from Boston. It was from Massachusetts General Hospital. A strange feeling of unease settled over Abigail as she opened it. The letter was an offer, a stunning one. The hospital was opening a new wing for women's and children's medicine and wanted to offer her the position of head nurse. It was the dream she had abandoned, the culmination of all her years of work and advocacy handed back to her. That night, she showed the letter to Nathaniel. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict that was tearing at her. Her career versus her family. The life she had trained for versus the life she had found. "It's a remarkable opportunity," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I can't take it," she said, though the words felt like a betrayal of a part of herself. "My life is here now, with you and Catherine." "Is it?" he asked gently. "Or is this just another sacrifice you feel you have to make?" "I will not be the reason you abandon your calling, Abigail. We could move to Boston." The thought was absurd. Nathaniel, a man of the mountains and open spaces confined to a city. Catherine, a child of the wilderness, trapped in crowded streets. No. She couldn't ask that of them. The choice seemed impossible, a cruel trick of fate. She sat at the small desk for a long time that night, the letter before her. She thought of her skills, of the great need for trained medical personnel, not just in the polished halls of Boston, but here on the frontier, where life was fragile and help was far away. An idea began to form, a bold, audacious counterproposal. She picked up her pen, and the words began to flow. Their move to Cheyenne took place in the autumn. Abigail's proposal had been met with initial skepticism by the hospital board in Boston, but her passionate arguments, combined with a surprise endorsement and offer of additional funding from a now supportive Victor Hayward, had won them over. The Thorne School of Frontier Nursing was born. Their new home, designed and built by Nathaniel on a plot of land overlooking the city, was a beautiful, practical structure that served as both a residence and a training facility. On their first day, after the last of the wagons was unloaded, Nathaniel brought out a small burlap-wrapped bundle. It was a sapling carefully dug from the soil of their homestead in red pine. Together, as the sun set behind the Laramie Mountains, Nathaniel, Abigail, and Catherine planted the young tree in the yard of their new home. It was a small, hopeful thing, its roots taking hold in new ground. It represented their past, a life of secrets and solitude, now replanted, reaching for the open sky, of a shared future. Their family, born from a child's deception, forged in a blizzard and tested by the ghosts of the past, had found its true home, not in a place, but in each other.